Hello and welcome back to the Wine School with Noel Green. This week we're looking at Burgundy. And the first thing to say is that good Burgundy is never cheap. It needn't be expensive, and I hope to demonstrate that today, but some of these wines I think of as sort of birthday or Christmas sort of wines for occasional treats rather than everyday drinking. So if you want to taste these as we go through the talk today, great. If you want an alternative that's a bit cheaper so you get the same sort of impression, I can't pretend they're in the same league. The Domaine de la Motte Shadley and the Pinot Noir and the Chardonnay from Louis Jadot that we stock are good alternatives. They'll give you the same impression, the same sense of place that these wines give, but I think if we're looking at the terroir and the really interesting wines that can be produced in Burgundy, these are the ones to look at. So it could be that you taste these today or come along and taste them afterwards on a special occasion with the talk we've done today in mind, and hopefully increase your knowledge about Burgundy as a whole. Now, despite only accounting for about 3% of France's wine production, Burgundy in the French national consciousness is very much at the heart of their understanding of wine and of food. It's very much the heart of gastronomy in France as well. And these wines are all really good food wines as well as being good to drink on their own. The vine was first planted in France, in Burgundy and the whole of France, as we've discussed before, by the Romans. They really sort of brought the culture of the vine across Europe. But it was in the 12th century the monasteries really started to plant these vineyards on a much bigger scale, and they started to explore the different areas, and they found that some vineyard sites were better than others, particularly those up on the slopes. And this was the start of what became later refined into the appellation system we have in Burgundy now, which is a hugely complex network of different vineyard sites, little walled vineyards, really exciting and interesting, but I can only just give you a taster of that today. But I hope it gives you a basic understanding to build on as you explore this region. Now, there's a number of different varieties that are permitted in Burgundy: Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Gris, several others, but the main ones that account for most of the wines that we know are Chardonnay for white wine and Pinot Noir for red. Those classic wine varieties that have been sort of taken across the world, but this is their homeland, their heartland, and where we find some of the best expressions of the two grapes. Due to some of the Napoleonic laws of inheritance, where all the children have to inherit, a lot of Burgundy, more so than any other area in France, the vineyards have been divided and subdivided, so you've got some of the smallest holdings of any vineyard land in France. In some cases people own just like one row of vines in one field, one row in another. There's a lot of intermarriage in the area as well, which helps consolidate these, which is why you see a lot of double-barreled names like Fontaine Gagnard, Gagnard de la Grange, who are all related to each other on a lot of the labels in Burgundy, which does help consolidate it. But the main thing that makes Burgundy accessible to us is the negociant houses, the big boys like Faverly, Bouchard, Rhône, and they buy wines from all over Burgundy to make, for example, one we're going to come to, a marketable quantity of a wine, rather than one little barrel or a few bottles here and there of these wines that can be interesting, but it means you can get a Pouilly-Fuissé at a standard sort of marketable amount from a good producer. Some of the negociant houses own their own vineyards, but most of them they deal with a third person, a broker called a courtier, who acts on behalf of the big houses and buys up all these little parcels from different growers to make one homogeneous whole. The problem with this massive subdivision is you do get a lot of complexity. You can get one vineyard area, for, let's say, Géry-Chambertin, and you may have a single vineyard or a monopole owned by just one house, which we'll come to later. You can get one made by a negociant, you can get a Pouilly-Fuissé made by a small grower who only makes a few barrels, and they're all at vastly differing prices. Unlike in Bordeaux, where there is the chateau and it's a known quantity, Pouilly-Fuissé can be sort of £20, 30, 50, depending on the producer and the quality and the care and attention and the price that they can command on the open market. So it's never quite as straightforward as just the wine on the label. If you look at a map of Burgundy as a whole, you can see Shadley way off to the northwest, which is very separate. I actually think of Shadley as being more of a part of Champagne. It's very different from the Chardonnays you find further south. Heading down from Shadley, just south of Dijon, you've got the Côte d'Or, which is divided into the Côte de Nuit and the Côte de Beaune, with the pretty little town of Beaune in between. South of this, you have the Chalonnaise, the Côte Chalonnaise, and then the Mâconnais. And then further south from this, we've got Beaujolais, which we'll look at another time separately. It is part of Burgundy as a whole, but its wines are quite different, the soils are quite different, there's a very distinct change. And then further south of that is the Rhône Valley. But here today we're going to start with Shadley. Chablis has a very lean character. It's got that lovely steely minerality, and this is partly due to the soils it's on. The whole of Burgundy is on the Paris Basin, which is a huge bed of limestone. And some of the soils are decomposed into limestone marl, which is a type of clay. Some of them are Portlandian limestone. We'll discuss that more in a minute. In the meantime, let's get started on this first wine. The first impression I get from this is a lovely green apple character, a little bit of lime blossom. And again on the palate, the first thing you get is that lovely mouth-watering acidity. Bags of lime and green apple, really razor-sharp acidity that just holds it all together. This is a really good wine with oysters, that's the classic match, but the acidity means it can go with lots of other things like Asian fusion cuisine, lots of Asian dishes it works really well with. Just it's got that clean acidity that can cut through anything. This wine has a little bit of it spent some time in oak. Now oak is not a hallmark of Chablis, they tend to avoid it, but some of the fuller, richer wines like this, they do use a little bit of oak, not to give an oak flavour. You don't want any of that toastiness that you might find further south, but it does just give it that extra complexity and a little creaminess, just to take the edge off the acidity a little bit. The other thing to mention with this wine is it is domain bottled, and that means that the vineyards are completely owned by William Febvre, so they've got complete control over the production from the time in the vineyard, the harvesting and everything, rather than being bought in grapes. William Febvre do produce a Chablis that does not have the word domain on the front, and it's usually I think £5 to £10 cheaper, because although it's a good wine, the grapes are bought in from various different sources, so they don't all have exactly the same quality level that they do and that they insist on in their own vineyards. The subsoils here, Kimmeridgian marl is the basis of most of Chablis vineyards, and it's a fairly free draining soil, which has got what gives the wines its purity. Vines love to get their roots right down, about 40 feet in some cases, and they love that free draining soil. And the vineyards of Petit Chablis, which you may be familiar with, they're based on Portlandian limestone, which is a bit brittler and a bit more free draining. Also Petit Chablis up on the plateaus. So the combination of the two give the wines a little bit more freshness, not quite the intensity of Chablis itself. And although they're good wines, I think they never quite measure up to Chablis proper, as it were. From here, instead of heading directly south, I want to go right down to the bottom, to the Mâconnais, to pick up the first wine that we're going to do from this area. Mâcon is right next to Beaujolais, and like Beaujolais, it was often seen as the basis of good bistro wine, sort of average, everyday drinking wine, not in the same sort of class as those from further north in the Côte d'Or. One exception to this is Pouilly-Fuissé, which has always been regarded as a quality area. But like Beaujolais, it's had a bit of a renaissance, and some of the wines have now been taken more seriously. And Mâcon Village, Mâcon Luni, all of these wines from this area, as well as Pouilly-Fuissé, are now the benchmark of good entry-level Chardonnay from Burgundy. So this one we have here is from a negociant house. So as I mentioned before, this means that they've collected grapes from all over Pouilly-Fuissé from various growers. Some of it will be from their own vineyards, but it's not domain bottled, unlike the Chablis. So you're getting a good quality. Bouchard, Père and Fil are a very good negociant house, so it's almost like a brand, if you want to use a supermarket phrase. You know what you're going to get with them because they've got a good solid reputation. Now it may be useful here to try the wines together, because this one, you'll notice immediately it doesn't have that flinty sharpness. It's a much more riper fruit. If you think of the Chablis as being green apple, Granny Smith, this is more ripe, golden, delicious, almost like a red apple aroma and flavour. It's got much, you can tell it's from a slightly warmer climate. And the impression on the palate is the same. You've got that lovely ripe fruit, a little bit of toastiness from the oak. It's not overdone, they've just used enough oak to balance out the fruit character. It's really well judged. A lot of wines, even from Burgundy, I find the oak can dominate, even at the top end in Meursault and Chassagne-Montrachet, wines like that. Unless it's really well integrated or aged, I find sometimes the oak sticks out a little bit. In this really quite modest wine from Burgundy, I find the oak really nicely balanced. Given this wine's got a little bit more richness than the Chablis, I think it would be perfect with fish, but also it would work with something like braisé chicken or a roast turbot in a creamy sauce, something a little bit richer. Now, the Côte d'Or is where the geological fault line that runs all the way through Burgundy is really apparent. Driving along the motorway, you can actually see the escarpment. It's like a layer cake where the geological fault has basically pulled the land apart, and most of the vineyards are sunk into the basin left behind. You can see the geological fault here, and most of the best vineyards are on the slope. So you get that aspect of slightly sheltered by the escarpment itself in the mid-slope. You've got some of the wash away from the slope into the soil, so you get that free draining aspect, and you're not lower down where the soils could be a bit deeper. And grapes really like to have deep roots in thin, poor soils. That's really where you get the best fruit, and that real sweet spot in some of the Côte d'Or is where you find some of the best village wines in this area. As I mentioned before, there was this period of trial and error, for want of a better phrase, over hundreds of years of people planting vineyards all across the Côte d'Or and Burgundy as a whole, and they were finding that these certain vineyards produce some of the best wines. And this mystical term terroir, which is like a mixture of the vineyard site, the soil, the weather, the aspect, and the area as a whole. It's often seen as a mystical thing, but actually that we're now finding that the geological knowledge we have about the way the subsoils are in Burgundy is really underpinning exactly where the best sites are. It's these sites with these thin, poor soils, because when the land subsided, it didn't subside as a whole, it was actually fractured. So you find some much higher than others, some with quite deep soils, some with very shallow soils. So although the vineyards look exactly the same next to each other from one side of the road to the next, on one side you'll have a Grand Cru, and on the other side you'll have Bourgogne Rouge. And there's no apparent reason why the two should be so different, but when you actually dig deep into the soil, the answer's there. The Côte d'Or is the region with the names we most associate with the top end of Burgundy: Mercer, Chassagne-Montrachet, Corton, Gevrey, all these names that we associate with the most expensive wines in the world. In fact, at the very top end, although it's not available on the open market, I just went looking for a price for Domaine de la Romanie-Conti. They've got a monopole, their own single vineyard of Von Romani, and although it's on a restaurant price list, Claridge's in this case, the 1996 is listed at £29,600 a bottle. So yes, as I said earlier, some of these wines, particularly this one, are at the pricier end of this tasting, but they are dwarfed by the prices some of the top end of Burgundy can command. Domaine de la Romanie-Conti tends to go retail for anything between £5,000 and £20,000 a bottle, depending on vineyard and vintage. So this looks cheap in comparison. So what we have here is from Michel Gros, who's a very well regarded producer. It's a monopole, and in this case, it's not Côte de Nuit, it's Haute Côte de Nuit. So as I mentioned before, there's the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuit. They're also on the slopes above them, the higher slopes, which are generally a little bit too cold. They are the Haute Côte de Nuit and the Haute Côte de Beaune. But in warm vintages that are actually too warm for some of the other areas, they can produce some very, very good wine from these areas. Haute Côte de Nuit is one of those areas that I think is well worth seeking out from a good producer like this. On the nose, it really couldn't be anything else other than Pinot Noir, but it doesn't jump at you like an Otago Pinot Noir has that lovely, immediate, velvety richness, or crushed raspberry fruitiness of a typical example from Chile. And again on the palate, it's plush, it's velvety, it's got fruit there, but it's not overt primary fruit, it's got a little bit of development. This is 4 years old now, I think. So it's starting to develop, and it could, if it aged a little longer, because it's got that really tight acidity to hold it all together. Pinot takes on a slightly leaf mouldy, occasionally a little bit of a farmyardy smell. Depends on your taste. I prefer mine a little younger like this. If you want something a bit more funky and interesting, then lay it down for a few years. But it is typically Burgundy, and it could only come from a warmer vintage, given that it's from the Haute Côte. It's got lovely length as well. I can still taste it now. It's going on and on and on. Just a really good wine for the price, I think, from Burgundy, which is an area often at the top end. I've had some Grand Cru Burgundies that really tasted quite ordinary and very much smack of the Emperor's New Clothes. And if you spent £70 to £100 on a bottle, you really want a bit more than that. And others like this, where I think at this price, this punches well above its weight, which, to be honest with you, is unusual for Burgundy. Normally, you either get what you pay for, you can occasionally be disappointed, but if you look for the right producer or a negociant from the right area, I think it's some of the best wines in the world are from this area. I hope that's whetted your appetite for Burgundy and it's inspired you to look a little bit beyond the generic Macon and things like that, which are great wines, but to explore a little bit more and treat yourself occasionally to some of these bottles, because I think they're really quite special. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you again next time at the Wine School. Thank you.